Hello and welcome back to the Boxing Social podcast in association with Betfred, with me, your host, Rob Tebbutt. As always, before we get started today, if I could just remind you to please follow, subscribe and turn those notifications on for more boxing content. But enough of that. I am delighted to be joined once again by the one and only Mike Costello, formerly of BBC, now of DAZN. Mike, always a pleasure to catch up with you. How are you doing?
Pleasure to be here, Rob.
Nice to see you. I think the last time I saw you would have been
in a bubble.
In a bubble, I think. And at this time, this was before we had the announcement that you were going to be going over to Matchroom and, of course, leading up the commentary over there. So first and foremost, congratulations on the new role.
Thank you.
How are you finding things?
It's absolutely fascinating because I thought, even back then in the bubble, that, you know, I'd been 15 years commentating on BBC Radio, and that was where my career was going to finish. And then Eddie Hearn talked to me at various points during the various bubbles about what they were planning, both in terms of Matchroom and DAZN. And I just came to the conclusion that this chance wouldn't come around again to have a crack at television commentary, a very different type of commentary. And I know those on the outside might think, what's the difference between radio and television? Commentary is commentary, but it's not. It's very different. And it's very different in different sports. For example, I worked at the Olympic Games in athletics, and if you were to listen back to a television commentary from anywhere in the world of the men's 100 metres final, for example, and my commentary on radio, they'd actually be quite similar. Whereas in boxing, they're actually very different. And I was saying right back at the beginning when it was first announced that my first task would be to learn how to shut up. And 3 bills in, I'm still getting there. But it's just been fascinating to learn a new skill at this stage of my career.
Now, you make a good point there. We're going to come straight onto that as you've just brought it up there, but about kind of the difference, the technical difference between commentating for radio where nobody can see anything and, of course, on television where people can see things. I think it's fair to say that part of the old, I don't want to call it regime, but part of the old setup over at Sky, I think, obviously I'm on social media an awful lot, and I think one of the things that was always kind of discussed and was often quite a hot topic was the commentary. Coming from a radio background and going into a new world and a new technique, any pressure, or you look at it as I'm assuming you were very excited to get started. How was that initial phase of getting started?
Yeah, I think one of the first challenges was to really get in touch with the tempo. And going back to what I was saying about learning when to shut up, sometimes the instinct is to stop talking just because it's television, whereas the action might warrant some commentary. And if there's a 3-minute round that warrants 3 minutes of commentary, then that's the way it has to be. Whereas if it's a fairly tedious round, then the commentary becomes more conversational. The commentary becomes comment. And that's something that I'm still coming to terms with and still learning. And that's, as I say, that's the fascination of the new job for me, whereas on radio, it's just about describing every punch. And then at the end of the 3 minutes, Andy Lee or Carl Frampton, whoever I happen to be working with, and Steve Bunce would come in and explain why what's happened has happened and what might happen in the next round to come. So it's very different. And it's something that I'm still, in terms of the tempo, getting used to. There's no doubt about that. But I had a really good show in Spain last weekend in Barcelona where I did 7 fights on the bill, very different fights. Some of them were one-sided. The main event was a cracking contest. And so that was valuable experience in terms of getting used to this new style of commentary.
How far do you think you are away from kind of getting it, so to speak? I'm assuming that no matter what you do, whether it's commentary or anything in life, you're always trying to learn, trying to improve. How far away do you think you are from feeling like you've got it?
I think the first big test, Rob, will come when there's a huge fight. And I had one last week that didn't happen in Leeds. 2 rounds of Josh Warrington against Mauricio Lara, the rematch. That was just beginning to build with a massive crowd, massive occasion, with so much at stake for Josh Warrington and for Lara. So that was the perfect setting, in a sense, even though that was only my second gig. That kind of occasion, you know, what I am used to, having kind of claimed almost an innocence and an inexperience around television commentary, what I have done many of is big occasion commentary, whether it's Super Saturday at the Olympics or the big heavyweight title fights or whatever. So that was an occasion when I thought this is really growing. The ring walks, the noise, 20,000 people, even radio against TV, the noise is still very, very important for delivering to a viewer's home. And that was just beginning to build on my card, and I think a lot of people reflect this. Warrington won the first round, Lara won the second round. I couldn't see it being anything but a really genuinely exciting fight. I don't know which way it was going to go. There seemed to be a lot of people thinking that Lara was already getting on top. I didn't see it that way. I thought that we were in for a memorable contest, and I think that could have been a chance for me to show whether or not I've got there, as you say, whether I've arrived at that moment. And I think so. That's a long way of getting around answering your question, but I think it will take a big occasion fight to really test whether I've nailed it or not.
We've spoken in the past about, you make a good point there about the crowd noise. We've spoken in the past about that great night at Madison Square Garden with your now legendary commentary of Andy Ruiz and Anthony Joshua. Just staying with the crowd noise, we've spoken in the past about, this last 18 months or so, boxers, the gladiatorial side of things. We need that audience, that fever pitch in the air. Must have been great to have that back, albeit only for 2 rounds with Josh Warrington and Mauricio Lara.
But it was, and it was there for much more than 2 rounds, Rob, because Josh Warrington's campmate, Maxie Hughes, earlier on the bill, had beaten...
Fantastic as well.
Yeah, and had done it so well. And in surprise fashion. Not many people felt that he would do it. And so the atmosphere was stoked, and after that there was Conor Benn, and then there was Katie Taylor. Okay, those fights were both fairly one-sided, but that was a case of building the atmosphere, and all the time everybody there knew that still to come was Josh Warrington. So by the time Warrington appeared at the entrance from the dressing rooms, the entrance into the stadium proper, it was really at fever pitch. And then that ring walk, which was one of the great ring walks of all time in my view, by the time he got to the ring, the place was really stoked. And I've said since that crowd of 20,000 was actually worth much more in terms of decibel level. It sounded much, much louder. And it's like going back to the old Ricky Hatton days, in that it seems to me anyway that everybody in there is really invested in what happens to Josh Warrington. You can go to other big events, whether it's for Canelo in the States or in Mexico or Anthony Joshua over here, and there's an element of it's an event to be seen at, and it's one to boast about the ticket stub. Whereas in the days gone by with Ricky Hatton, and I get it now in Leeds with Josh Warrington, as I did at Ellen Road when he won the title, it seems as though a win for him, it really is a win for everybody in the crowd as well. And there's a different intensity there. And so 20,000 in terms of noise is worth much more.
While we're on Josh Warrington and Mauricio Lara, obviously not the ending that anybody would have wanted on the night. What do you see next for Josh Warrington? Obviously, people are talking about the trilogy. People are talking about potentially him moving on for a Lee Wood or a Kid Galahad rematch, something like that. What do you think happens next for him?
It's interesting because he was saying afterwards that as far as Lee Wood is concerned and Kid Galahad is concerned, even though he hasn't boxed Lee Wood, that's business that's in the past. It's in his rearview mirror. But I don't know whether he will be tempted around to the notion of one of those two. And if he had a choice, I'm sure he'd go for Lee Wood rather than a rematch with Kid Galahad, who made it very difficult for him. But I don't see the route being a third fight against Lara. I have to say, if I was advising him, I wouldn't go that route. For me, he's got over the psychological hurdle of having to face him again. Okay, he didn't win the fight, so maybe there is still, for him, business to be finished there. But I think he showed a lot by wanting to get straight back in with Lara. And I just don't know, in a non-title fight, what there is for him to gain by going back in with Lara. And I think there's a bigger opportunity out there for him, whether it's against Galahad or against Lee Wood or beyond that, and maybe going to the States for another non-title fight and trying to build his profile over there. I don't know, but I certainly wouldn't be looking to push him for a third fight against Lara if I had anything to do with it.
Yeah, I think I was quite surprised that they went back in, well, that Josh Warrington went straight back in, admittedly kind of 6 months down the line, but went straight back into the rematch. Again, as you mentioned, another non-title bout against Mauricio Lara. I think people forget that the first fight was actually a non-title bout because obviously Warrington had relinquished his IBF title before then. So yeah, I think that's quite interesting to see what happens with Josh Warrington. Before we got started, we had a very interesting talk about the Tokyo Olympics. Always do this. We always try and keep things for the podcast, end up talking for 5 minutes beforehand anyway. But you were one of the lucky few, I should say, who went out to Tokyo and witnessed a very different Olympic Games, of course, with the COVID-19 pandemic scuppering a lot of plans, moving a lot of things. At one point it was on, off, no fans, Japanese fans only. What was the experience like out there for you?
It was different and it was difficult at times, but it was fascinating also to witness how the Games was happening in such difficult circumstances, because that was the 8th Olympic Games that I've been at. And one of the joys of the Games, I've always said in the past, and for the last 5 Games, I've concentrated solely on athletics. So I've been in the main showpiece stadium for 10 days of the Games. And that was the same this time around. But what was missing was that chance to get a feel for the city where the Games are, whether it's Rio or Barcelona, my first Games, and just to mingle with the local people on tubes, buses, trams and trains, whatever the case may be, on the way into the stadium, on the way out of the stadium, getting food afterwards. But that wasn't possible this time because of the restrictions. We were on and off media buses into the stadium, out of the stadium 4 times a day, and straight back to the hotel, to our residences. We had 3 days of what they called hard quarantine, first of all, and then 14 days of softer quarantine. The 3 days hard quarantine was literally in the room for 3 days. We were allowed to leave for 15 minutes, to leave the hotel to go to a local store, a kind of a 7-Eleven store or whatever it was called. But there was a security guard on the door of the hotel timing you out and timing you in, and it was 15 minutes out and in, back to the room. And then after that, the next 14 days were restricted in the sense that you had to let the local organising committee know where you were going. So in Games gone by, if I had a chance to go to watch boxing in between the athletic sessions, then I would wander over to that venue if it was doable in the time span. But that wasn't possible this time unless I'd given the authorities notice that I'd be getting on this bus at that time going to this venue. And that was understandable because they were so worried about rising cases of COVID. And they were just beginning to feel it in the kind of crisis sense that we've had for a year and more. And so they were trying to limit the damage that we as outsiders would bring into their country. And I'm telling you all this as a commentator, but what I saw in the stadium, and I know I've picked up since in terms of the standard in the boxing arena as well, is that it's just remarkable that these athletes, with all the uncertainty that they've had for a year and more, wondering whether the Games are going to go ahead. The day I flew was the day before the opening ceremony, and on that day, one of the leading members of the organising committee said the Games might still be cancelled. So you imagine that as a competitor, all the work that you've done in the build-up, and you're just beginning to, boxers would know this, but all athletes and all competitors across the sports would know that they almost have a countdown. They would have known turning into 2021 when their heats are, when their semi-finals are, when their final is, down to the day of the calendar, the hour of the day. They would have been saying on New Year's Day, New Year's Eve going into New Year's Day, they would have been saying on August the 2nd, I'll be getting up at 6 a.m. That's how these top-class athletes work. So to be told or to be almost cautioned the day before that, hang about, these Games might not happen. And that kind of uncertainty was filtering all the way through. There were many newspapers over here that were talking about the Games not going ahead for months and months in the build-up. So with that in mind, how do you go to the gym, to the training track, time and time again, and absolutely put everything in? But these people did, and what I saw in the stadium was sport just about as good as I've ever seen at an Olympic Games, with world records and performances generally that were of such a high standard that it's astonishing that these athletes psychologically got themselves ready in the way that they did. And I know you followed the boxing a lot from back here in the UK, and you'll agree that the standards in boxing were as high as I've known also at the Olympic Games, in particular in the women's boxing. But again, given all the uncertainty that's been around all of the sports and all of those competitors, it was amazing that they produced what they did in those circumstances.
I agree. Just to echo everything you've said there, people also have to understand that these athletes have been training for these games for years and years, not even just the 4-year cycle, since they were young
That's the
children.
misconception. I think a lot of people say, oh, they've been training for 4 years for this. They've been training forever for this, most of these athletes. It doesn't come around, by chance. It's years and years of hard graft, and years of mental torture sometimes as well, getting over injuries, getting over not being selected in boxing terms, or whatever the case may be. And to still have all of that uncertainty all the way through to the start line is really difficult, and that's what they had to overcome, and they did.
It's an incredible mental resolve that athletes of that level have to have anyway, but even to kind of up the stakes even more and have that additional uncertainty really does make you appreciate just how dedicated and just how good these athletes are in their respective fields. You mentioned the boxing there. I understand that you didn't catch an awful lot of it, but from what you saw, what did you make of the boxing? Obviously, we've spoken about the level being very, very high, very successful games for Team GB's boxers. I think we've got the highest number of medals, we've got 6 medals at the games. What did you make of it?
Yeah, I think if we look at the games in terms of what they mean for the game that we're in and the jobs that we're in, then boxing is flourishing in this country. And I remember Robert Smith from the Board of Control saying to me 5 or 6 years ago that one of the reasons that the sport is flourishing in the way it is in this country is because of the Olympic setup, the GB team in Sheffield, and how this ongoing cycle of talent is being pushed through time and again, Olympics after Olympics, World Championships after World Championships. So I think coming out of the Games, I think we can all be really buoyant about the next 3 and 4 years, the next Olympic cycle until the next group come through. But I got to see a couple of sessions early on. And going back to what we were saying, Rob, about what these athletes have to put in, Lauren Price boxed in her first contest on one of the days that I was there. And I interviewed her afterwards in the mix zone, and she was boxing at about 11:30 in the morning. And so I asked her what time she weighed in, and she weighed in at 6:30. So again, this is an element, particularly of the boxing, that most other sports don't have to deal with. Every time they compete, they have to weigh in. So her weigh-in's at 6:30 in the morning. So I think most people would understand that if you're getting up for work at 6:30 or you're getting up for a flight at 6:30 or whatever, most times you don't sleep because you're all the time fearing you don't hear the alarm, whatever the case may be. But she was almost nonchalant about it. Yeah, I knew it. So I knew, and she would have known weeks in advance that her contest was, after the draw had been made, that her contest would be not necessarily at 11:30, but she would have seen that on the draw weeks in advance, the middleweight preliminaries were at this time, and so she would have got her head round a weigh-in that would have been at 6:30. And that was, to me, again, just underlining how special these athletes, boxers, competitors are. But then I got to see the last day of finals when they had only 4 contests. And again, Lauren Price was there and won her final easily. In effect, her final was in the semi-final against Fontaine, the Dutch athlete, who she and Savannah Marshall have had issues with in the past. But also on that day was the contest between Keyshawn Davis, who I've been following on when I was on the BBC podcast for 3 years now, as for me, one of the great talents coming through, and I've been waiting for him to turn pro. But he was beaten for the 3rd time by the Cuban Andy Cruz on that last day of finals. And I know we agree that it's unlikely that we will see a contest, amateur or pro, anywhere in the world this year with that much talent in the same ring at the same time. It's just fantastic, and it would be wonderful to see them both turning over. I know Keyshawn Davis has already turned over and had gone back because the Olympic rules allow that now, but to see him against Cruz one day down the line, and I know as we stand, even with the political situation possibly changing in Cuba, that for the moment Cruz is going to have to defect for that fight to happen. But just in that fantasy world of what fights would you love to see, I mean, Keyshawn Davis against Andy Cruz for a light welterweight battle, 3-4 years down the line when they're both really seasoned pros, that would be one to see. But that was the highlight for me of my boxing experience at the Games. And just to talk about the venue there, it was a sumo wrestling venue, and one of the local volunteers there told me that he said, like you guys in the West, you have Madison Square Garden. This is our Madison Square Garden. And I just thought, Naoya Inoue, the great Japanese bantamweight now, has boxed there early on in his career, and I just thought if there'd been a crowd in there again, as I thought many times in the stadium, what a special atmosphere that would have been in what's revered as one of the great Japanese sports venues. Wasn't to be, but again, in the absence of crowds, they produced some fantastic sport.
It was a fantastic tournament. Obviously, we'd spoken briefly before we started. For my sins, I decided to stay up and try and watch most of it in the middle of the night. Considering amateur boxing in recent years and recent Olympics, even with AIBA, it's not always come off the best. I think it's fair to say that AIBA have had a few problems over the years, and it was really great to see such a high standard of boxing throughout. I think by and large the judging was pretty much bang on throughout. The officiating was excellent throughout. We've discussed Keyshawn Davis there as somebody who's turned over as a professional and gone back and competed at the Olympic Games. Of course, the same is true of Bakadir Jalolov, who won the super heavyweight Olympic gold medal. What's your thoughts on pros going back and competing with amateurs? Of course, it's not always the case with that. They're successful in doing so, but say Jalolov won his gold medal match against Richard Torres. What's your thoughts of it overall?
Having waxed about Keyshawn Davis, I don't like it. I think it's almost contamination that, throughout history, they've been very separate. The amateur stroke Olympic code and the professional code. And when you talk and you listen to people like Oscar De La Hoya, even going back to Cassius Clay, later Muhammad Ali, Floyd Patterson, I remember in an interview I did very early on in my career, talking about how special winning Olympic gold was and how separate that is. And it's different to other sports. Usain Bolt will run 100 meters in the Olympic Games, and when he leaves the Olympic Games, the competition is exactly the same. All of the conditions are the same. One of the joys of Olympic boxing is the guesswork that we can get into as to how De La Hoya is going to cope, how Evander Holyfield's going to cope, how Floyd Mayweather's going to cope over the longer distances and in very different circumstances under the lights and with all the hype in the build-up to fights. And to have some of that taken away, and I realise that it's highly unlikely that you're ever going to see a Mayweather or a Canelo dropping back into the Olympic Games. I get that, even after the push in 2016 for that to happen. I realise that isn't going to happen, but even so, I think it should be very separate, very distinctive in its appeal and in its history and in its tradition, and left alone from the professional game. So in my view, Keyshawn Davis shouldn't have been allowed to compete. He still, in many senses, looked like somebody who was still trying to shake off those amateur-style habits. But at the same time, I think it should be left alone. And I wonder whether, when we get back to an Olympic Games that is organised by AIBA, the Olympic governing body, then I wonder whether that will be one of the moves that's rescinded, whether professionals will be barred from competing. I get the sense there'll be a push for that. But just as we speak, Rob, in the last couple of days, within the last 48 hours, the International Olympic Committee have said that they're not at all happy with the so-called reforms that have been made by AIBA, the so-called governing body. Now, if you look at what happened at the Olympic Games, then maybe it's best that AIBA aren't involved at all. But the problem is you have to have a sport that's organised elsewhere within the Olympic circle, the Olympic cycle. You can't just have a task force, as was the case this time, turning up with 18 months to go and putting on the Olympic boxing tournament. It's all the regional, the confederational events that happen around it that are so important to the development of boxers. There has to be an international federation looking after all of that before you get anywhere near the Olympic Games. So the amateur side, stroke Olympic side, because I know they don't like to use the word amateur, is in danger. And there is still a chance, we shouldn't overlook this, there is still a chance that there won't be boxing in Paris at the Olympics in 2024. And that's not a case of sensationalising. Right now, just in the last couple of days, the Olympic Committee have written to Ivy and said that they're not happy with what's going on in that particular organisation. And just one more point, which is a real beef of mine, Rob, around what AIBA are doing and refusing to use the word amateur. That's the world that I come from, and I know people still in that world. Not far from here where we're talking today, the most successful club in the history of British amateur boxing, the Repton Club. I worked not alongside, but in conjunction with people from that club. I was at the Lynn Club in South East London for years as a boxer and as a coach. And for people at that lofty position in AIBA to claim that we no longer need the word amateur, when clubs in this country and many countries around the world are being underpinned by people who give hours and hours and hours of their time for no recompense at all. For them to say that there's no room for the word amateur anymore is just disgusting, and they have no idea what goes on at the grassroots end of the sport. And because of that, they have no qualms with allowing professionals to come back into Olympic-style boxing. I understand that the British team, the Cuban team, the Russian team, many of the teams in the former Soviet states are professional in everything but
the word.
But the word. But having said that, there is a very separate sport that's been thriving and flourishing for decades alongside the Olympic-style boxing. And that's why I used the word earlier on, contaminated, and that's how I feel, and that's why I have grave concerns about the future of the sport in the Olympics, and we shouldn't underestimate how important that is to the future of the professional sport generally.
Yeah, I agree, and I was going to come on to that next, but you've covered it in the last 48 hours. Of course, the threat of it not being at Paris in 2024, which I think is obvious would be a hammer blow to boxing in general, both amateur and professional. Just before we move on, let's touch upon some of the Team GB medalists or Team GB team. Any in particular fighters to keep an eye on as they all look set to turn professional? Obviously, we're waiting to hear. Anybody who you're going to be looking out for in particular in the pro game?
Not necessarily particularly from that bunch, but what I would say is that to do what they've done at the Olympic Games gives them a very strong grounding. And, the likes of Pat McCormack, in a very, very competitive division, his ability to see a punch and, the old mantra, make them miss and make them pay, I think is very high quality. Ben Whittaker, I think, has got the kind of style that will work in the professional ranks. And I think that Lauren Price will be moving into a middleweight division, maybe even come down in weight is what I'm hearing. Again, with that kind of experience behind them, that high quality elite competition behind them, I think they all stand a really strong chance. And looking at another one of the gold medalists, Galal Yafai as well. And okay, at the top end, if he was to fight as a pro at Superfly, which would be corresponding to how much he weighed at the Olympic Games, although the division was called flyweight in the Olympics. I know the top end of the super flyweight division, where his brother's been world champion, is really strong, but it might not be so strong in a couple of years' time, when the likes of Estrada, Chocolatito might have moved on. It will always be difficult, and at his age, he's going to have to kick on quite quickly. But I think that pedigree, to get a medal, in particular to get a gold medal at the Olympic Games, I think is the sign of somebody who's going to make a dent in the professional ranks. Just one caveat and one note of caution I would say, Rob, is that I had a discussion in one of the bubbles that we spoke about earlier on with Shane McGuigan. And it was at the time that Lawrence Okoli was about to fight for the world title. And we were talking about his limited experience compared to some others at the GB squad and in the amateur ranks in particular. And he said sometimes that can be a bonus, in that sometimes those amateurs that come through from the GB squad have had so much competition, and maybe someone like Pat McCormack here, they've had so much competition at a very high level that when they leave the amateur ranks, there's already a degree of burnout in them, and they have to be managed, promoted, trained very carefully and differently to some others. And so that's why I think there's a caveat just to be added to any excitement around these, that they've been boxing in a very high level of competition for some time, and therefore that can have an effect. I know it's not necessarily as brutal as the professional game, and it's only over 3 rounds. I say only because sometimes the 3 rounds are mightily competitive. But over the course of time, if you just look at the nature of the competition at the Olympic Games 5 contests in about 10 days. Again, every time having to make weight.
The weight, exactly.
Then when you do that at a World Championships, you do that at a qualifier, you do that at sometimes at multi-nations tournaments that we never hear about unless you're absolutely enmeshed in the game, then that can take its toll over time. And so there is just that note of caution that, you know, there is the potential for burnout already with some of these athletes simply because they're so good.
Well, that leads us into what I want to talk about in a very nice way. We're speaking about Olympic gold medalists. We are going to see 2 Olympic gold medalists this week. It's actually next week, but this is going to go out next week, so that's fine. This week, Anthony Joshua, of course, London 2012 super heavyweight Olympic gold medalist, faces Oleksandr-Usyk, London 2012 heavyweight gold medalist, in a fight that I've been wanting to see for a number of years, and I know you're the very same. First and foremost, we spoke about big-time boxing being back. It doesn't get much bigger than the Unified Heavyweight Championship of the World. Packed-out stadium at Tottenham Hotspur. I'm very excited, and I'm sure you're the same.
I can't wait, yeah, and I'm not going to be working at this one, and this is something that I had to mull over in making this decision to move aside. I knew that, for example, the next Anthony Joshua fight wouldn't be on my radar because he's still fulfilling his contract with Sky, and so having moved to DAZN, and 5 Live have signed the rights to that. So this is a fight that I would have been working on, and it's the first Joshua fight in a long time that I've not been commentating on, but that hasn't diluted my excitement for the contest as an event. And I think when we got to Headingley for the Josh Warrington fight, on that night, as the ground gradually filled up, I can't remember who it was, Rob, but I turned to somebody and said, you know, we've been kidding ourselves about the lack of crowds and how boxing is still thriving and can still happen. And when you think back to our time in the bubbles, and we were... I now fully admit I was just kidding myself that this is all right, because when the crowds are back, it's just so different. The buzz on that night, just the tingle on that night. You know, when there's that first piece of action, whether it's a boxer on the undercard going down or a great exchange of punches in a corner or whatever, the first time that the crowd really roar, and you look around and they might be just sort of dotted around the stadium, but because it's a big stadium, and I've seen this and heard this at Wembley. I remember on the undercard of Carl Froch and George Groves, the rematch, and I can't remember the fight, it might have been Kevin Mitchell, but suddenly this roar went up, and you looked around and you thought actually the stadium was half empty, but there was this roar that almost made the place shake. And so I think that's, you know, that's what gives it the real event feel. And we're going to get 60,000 there later this week, and it's going to be a real special occasion. And look, it's a heavyweight world title fight when there is genuine uncertainty about the outcome, because you've got a seasoned heavyweight champion who hits hard, who's so dedicated to the sport, but you've got a man in the ring with him who you cannot deny is more skilled than he is, but that this question is, can he make his skills count, his elusiveness count, his cleverness count against the bigger, heavier puncher? So it's absolutely fascinating. I fancy Joshua, and I think he can get the job done, but it's not with any great degree of certainty.
You would have, I'm sure, covered Oleksandr-Usyk long before he turned professional. Do you remember covering him as an amateur? Do you remember any early thoughts of Oleksandr-Usyk?
No, the first that I saw of him live was at the Olympic Games in 2012. And I had heard about him, but the initial reviews I'd heard about Usyk were from a pal of mine who said I'd actually seen him in Beijing in 2008 at the Olympic Games there, and I didn't remember him from there. So he couldn't have had that much of an effect on me at that stage. But looking at what he did in 2012, it was clear that he'd learned from that experience. And I think that you look at how he's come through his professional career. I think as we stand, he's had 18 fights. And we're in this new era now of seasoned amateurs making their way through to the top in the professional ranks much quicker than they used to. Likewise, Josh Taylor, who came from the same Olympics in 2012, won gold at the Commonwealth Games in 2014, And I think he too has had 18 fights right now, and he's undisputed champion as Usyk has already been. And I think it's part of that deep amateur career that they've had that helps them to progress so quickly in the professional ranks, and actually makes a mockery of what I was saying earlier on about the potential for burnout. I actually still believe that's there, but if you look at the likes of Josh Taylor and Oleksandr Usyk, actually what they've had and experienced in terms of high-level elite competition in the amateur ranks has helped them progress very quickly in the professional ranks. And I think it's happened only over the last half a dozen years, really. And you look at Vasyl Lomachenko was kind of almost a model for it. But it's a sign that I think maybe in times gone by that promoters were too cautious with Olympic champions and very seasoned amateurs who turned over. Because if you look at what Usyk is doing now, already so soon in the professional ranks, then it's a sign that pedigree can prevail, whatever the distance in terms of rounds.
Much is said about the size difference going into this fight. I think, from my personal opinion, I think it's kind of a... Part of me says, well, it's a bit too simplistic to just say, oh, well, is he big enough? But then the other side of me says, well, is he big enough? Because I think it's obviously a legitimate tangible for this fight. How do you see Oleksandr Usyk as a heavyweight? We've only seen him twice as a heavyweight, against Chaz Witherspoon in a fight where I think he was supposed to box Tyrone Spong. Of course, Tyrone Spong failed a drugs test beforehand, so it was a late replacement. Then we saw him over in October of last year against Derek Chisora. So we've not seen an awful lot of him as a heavyweight. You mentioned there about burnout. We have seen Oleksandr Usyk suffer some injuries. I think he had a bicep injury, I think a shoulder injury as well. But do you feel that size is the greatest factor in this fight?
I do. Yeah, because I think had Usyk, or if we look at it another way, if Joshua was 2 stone lighter, then I think we'd all be fancying Usyk to win this one and win it well. But I think Anthony Joshua, has settled on, if not an optimum weight, then a range within which he produces his best. And I remember way back, and I've said this on previous podcasts, but Lennox Lewis once said after a mediocre performance that there's an optimum weight at which a heavyweight can operate, beyond which they can't make their way around the ring, particularly if they're of that kind of style where fluency and good footwork and ring generalship is really important. And this applies to Tyson Fury also. But there comes a point at which they can't operate at their best if they're too heavy. And I know Anthony Joshua has been thinking about that because of similar instances. I pretty much remember it was Carlos Takam where he weighed in.
Yeah, it was very heavy.
Much heavier than previously. And I know that was a late substitution, so that was a difficult one for him. But I do think that he's now settled on where he can operate best. And I like the idea that since the setback against Andy Ruiz, he's spoken about more boxing. I said to him in the build-up to the rematch against Andy Ruiz, what have you done differently? And it was just those 2 words, more boxing. It was much less about building the Adonis figure and putting the finishing touches to that statuesque figure. And I think that will serve him really well and will have served him well over the course of time. And it might well be that because he is such a student and so keen to learn, that actually the pandemic might have helped Anthony Joshua. I was very impressed by what he did against Kubrat Pulev, I have to say, although some people weren't and dismissed what sort of a challenge Pulev offered. But I think that the time in the gym will have served him really well. And we should remember that in the modern age, these men fight only twice a year anyway, so you can overplay the effects of ring rust and time away from the ring, because if you look back at the records of all of them, whether it's, Canelo at the moment is pursuing a slightly different path, but Mayweather, De La Hoya, Joshua through much of his world championship status career, they box only twice a year, so you can overplay the importance and I think the relevance and the effect of ring rust.
We've seen in the, you mentioned the Andy Ruiz rematch there, where we saw Anthony Joshua adopt a style that we hadn't really seen from him as a professional in that bout. And I think it carried over somewhat into the Kubrat-Pulev fight, where we saw him box at range. We also saw him obviously letting his hands go on the inside. What do you think is going to be the plan of attack for Oleksandr Usyk? Obviously a naturally smaller man than Anthony Joshua. Do you think we'll see Anthony Joshua revert slightly more to the more aggressive Anthony Joshua? Or do you think that post Ruiz 1, that Joshua maybe is not as likely to come out given what happened that night in New York?
Yeah, I was working on 5 Live for the fight against Pulev with 1,000 fans at Wembley, and I was working with Steve Bunce and Dillian White. And Dillian White came out with a phrase and said he believes Joshua is in between styles. And it was clear that he was trying to find this groove, if you like, this happy medium between the boxer that picked off Andy Ruiz in the second fight and the more aggressive Joshua that we'd become used to seeing. And I think we'll see more of that process on the night. I think that there'll be no inclination to go looking for Usyk. That's my view. I think he'll try to use his boxing skills, not necessarily to outbox Usyk, but to get home with those solid punches that get Usyk's respect early on, and maybe even make Usyk slightly wary of launching attacks of his own. I happen to think that the man who holds the centre of the ring here will be really important. Now, I know Usyk is very clever at boxing in the pocket and swivelling and making himself elusive around that close-knit area, but I think that if Joshua holds and dominates from the centre, then he can win this fight, and he can win it well. But there are endless possibilities because of the ability of Oleksandr Usyk. And there is just this guessing game that we have as, you know, how has he grown as a heavyweight? I mean, I was one of those who, for the fight against Chisora, thought it was one-sided. I thought that Usyk won it comfortably.
As did I, yeah.
And a lot of people at ringside, very close to ringside, said otherwise. But I thought Usyk was a comfortable winner. And that is a yardstick. And I think that for him was an invaluable experience as a heavyweight after the waste of time against Chaz Witherspoon in his first venture. So I think that Usyk clearly has grown into the division. And with all the science that's been available to not just the Ukrainians, but going back decades and decades to the Soviet Union, and which has been not so much stolen, but taken by the rest of the world since then, you know, all of that will have served him well in terms of building the body to suit. And I spoke about Anthony Joshua having or looking for an optimum weight. That will have been part of the process for Usyk as well, to make sure that he's only as heavy as he can possibly be and still perform at his cruiserweight best. That's the key for them, that they want to retain so much of that cruiserweight finesse, the speed, the agility, the thinking space, and not slow down any of those processes in the quest to move up in weight successfully, without at the same time, you know, forgetting that he has to have a greater degree of strength to take the punches that inevitably are going to get home.
One of the things that I've spoken to people, I've met, as you will have met Oleksandr Usyk on numerous occasions in the past, and one of the things that I was immediately taken by was just how thick set he was when meeting him. He is not your, you know, you kind of sometimes will get these fighters. Isaac Chamberlain just popped into my head as somebody who's probably is too big for 175 and maybe slightly too small for 200, whereas you have an Oleksandr Usyk, a Lawrence Okoli, who we've also spoken about, who are really small heavyweights who have boiled themselves down to cruiserweight. Usyk is not a small man. I think it's fair to say that anybody who's getting hit on the chin by an ex-Olympic gold medalist, undisputed cruiserweight champion is going to feel it. Do you feel he has the punching power on the night to hurt Anthony Joshua, to get his respect?
He has the punching power to get his respect. Whether he has the punching power to hurt him, I don't know. I mean, I would say that somebody who hits as well as he does, and with even 14.5, 15 stone behind it, is going to hurt when he lands cleanly. But in terms of the relative nature of what Joshua has taken in the heavyweight division, I think he would have to hit him often to really make a difference. But if you look back at Usyk's amateur career and this kind of hybrid event between the amateurs or the Olympic style boxing and the professional ranks, the World Series of boxing, when they fought over 5 rounds. If you look at film of his contest against Joe Joyce, he doesn't look like the smaller man. He doesn't look like the weaker man, but he still looks like the quicker man. He still looks like the cleverer man. Now, Joe Joyce, I get it, isn't Anthony Joshua, but I'm just saying you saw there from a man, Usyk, who was still having to come down to the heavyweight poundage in those amateur days. And the heavyweight poundage, coincidentally, is 14 stone 4, which is the cruiserweight
limit, yeah.
as a pro. So he was still having to move up, come down, move up. So when he was going up to fight the likes of Joe Joyce, that wouldn't have been a long, drawn-out process like we're seeing now in terms of the scientific background and the months and months of being able to chisel the body into the super heavyweight shape. That would have been just moving up because he wanted to test himself for the good of the team. And so if you look at that, he didn't look at all out of place as a heavyweight, whether in terms of size or speed. He didn't lose. Okay, it was only over 5 rounds, but he didn't lose any of the qualities that we've known him for. And I think that, you know, it's important to use all of those markers, any clues that we can find as to what might happen on Saturday night. But I can't tell you whatever I've been looking back at and you know, working out, trying to find the answers. It's still that tingle when they walk to the ring on Saturday night will still be there, because he could do it with one shot. Who knows? He could be the new dominant force in the heavyweight division.
And he truly believes he's going to win the fight. He has done for a number of years. There's that brilliant photo of Oleksandr Usyk in the crowd after Anthony Joshua's just knocked out Povetkin, and he's kind of like a Sith Lord with his hood over him. And I interviewed him in the hotel afterwards, and at the time he was obviously still at a cruiserweight, and he said, "No, I'm going to move up. I'm going to beat Anthony Joshua." And obviously Anthony Joshua, with all of the fanfare and the money that he brings along with him, he is the darling of the glamour division, the heavyweight division. You know, some people will call out his name for what the kids nowadays call clout, or will look for a big payday against an Anthony Joshua. He firmly believes that it is his destiny to win the heavyweight title. And based on what we've seen so far as a cruiserweight, you surely can't put it past somebody to go and do that, considering what he's achieved.
Yeah, and again, you can look for blemishes, for flaw from Usyk in past events as well, and you know, he was taken very close by Maurice Bradis in
a brilliant
World
fight that was.
Boxing Super Series. Again, we talked earlier on about Keyshawn Davis and Andy Cruz at the Olympic Games, and you look at the amount of skill in a different way, but in that professional sense, the qualities that each of those men brought to the ring on that night. So, you know, Usyk can be troubled as well, whatever his reasons for that fight being so close and so tense on the night. So you can look back and you can see flaws, you can see reasons why each of them can win this fight. But I do think, going right the way back to pretty much your first question about this fight, that size is natural size is huge. I think a huge factor in the potential outcome of this one.
I don't know if you're a betting man, but if you were a betting man, where would you put your money in this fight?
I'd put it on Joshua points.
7-2 at Betfred. Anyway, the last time we've spoken about these bubbles, which now feel like an awful long time ago. Now we're back to live events and live crowds. We spoke at the time. The world was waiting for Anthony Joshua versus Tyson Fury. The world is still waiting for Anthony Joshua versus Tyson Fury. Of course, Tyson Fury boxes Deontay Wilder in a few weeks, which we'll come on to talk about. But yeah, a disappointing time for the heavyweight division. Me, like yourself, we're waiting for that big announcement, 2 Brits and the undisputed title. We never quite got there.
No, and I think we've been talking a lot, and people in boxing have been talking a lot just in recent weeks about the negative side of this sport and how much is wrong with this sport. And it seems as though it's been really bleak in the last few weeks, in particular, with the positive test of Oscar Valdez and then the gushing response from the World Boxing Council and from others as to why he should be allowed to box. And then you had Evander Holyfield falling around a ring at the age of 58 and people wondering why on earth it's happening. And when you add into that the fact that the biggest fight in boxing, one of the biggest occasions in world sport, hasn't happened this year, then you understand why people wander away from this sport. And you shouldn't wonder why the likes of Jake Paul and Logan Paul can capitalise and can exploit the gaps that are being left. And I thought for a long time during those bubbles that the fight was going to happen. I thought I was going to miss it because I'd be in Tokyo. They were talking about 3 days.
I remember we were talking about
the first two of which were actually during Olympic competitions. So I would have missed the fight in Saudi Arabia, such as it was. And there seemed a certainty that the fight would happen, and then all of a sudden it doesn't happen. Now, both Fury and Joshua are talking about how they still want the fight to happen, but there is no question that this fight coming up against Oleksandr-Usyk, and then beyond that in a couple of weeks' time, the third fight between Fury and Wilder. Look, these, for us, who are so enmeshed in the sport, are huge events. But there's no question that for those on the outside, and the sport needs much more than the boxing hardcore, the boxing buffs. Those people on the outside are almost just shrugging their shoulders and just almost yawning, say, look, the fight we want is not happening. So don't expect me to get interested in Usyk against Joshua and Wilder against Fury, because all I'm interested in is the one that you told me for 6 months was going to be happening. So that's still a huge issue for boxing, is the best fighting the best, or not, as the case may be. And you can go through weight divisions and list the fights that you want to see right now that we might never get to see. As we speak, it seems like Errol Spence against Terence Crawford might be the best fight, or one of the best fights we never got to see. That might be spoken about down the years, like Lennox Lewis and Riddick Bowe, and the fights that we didn't get to see. And it's one of the reasons that actually Errol Spence against Terence Crawford would be massive for us. But for those on the edge of the sport, what I call the football fans who come in every now and again, because of what's happened in the sport, Errol Spence and Terence Crawford are just two great fighters who are known only to boxing people. And that shouldn't be the case. The two best exponents of the sport, or the two best welterweights in the world, if you only go back to the 1980s, and just this week as we speak, it's the 40th anniversary of the first fight between Sugar Ray Leonard and Tommy Hearns. I mean, everyone on the planet knew who they were. And I realise it's a very different media landscape now. I get all of that. But the fact that Errol Spence and Terence Crawford, let's be honest, I mean, you tell me if you disagree, could fight each other, and it would be a boxing event. It wouldn't be one of those events that transcends, that creeps beyond the borders of boxing and drags in the NFL fans and drags in the football fans over here. It wouldn't be. I don't think it would be. And that is a dying shame that two fighters of that quality can't draw in an audience beyond the sport's boundaries. And that's where we are. It's a troubling time. And I say this as somebody who's just taken on what I think is an exciting venture. But, it's a time when the sport has taken a lot of heavy hits in recent weeks and months, and it's going to take some recovery.
It certainly has, and just to echo your point there on Terence Crawford and Errol Spence, I think over the last few years, it's not necessarily a new thing in the sport to try and build a fight, or as they call it now, marinate a fight. But before you know it, something happens, and no pun intended, but obviously with Errol Spence's injury, in the blink of an eye, it's gone. It's Terence Crawford. God knows what's happening with Errol Spence. Obviously, we wish him well. Hope he returns to the ring soon. Going on Tyson Fury and Anthony Joshua, they're two difficult fights. Deontay Wilder is still a very, very dangerous man. He could quite easily unearth one of those right hands and put Tyson Fury to sleep. And then Anthony Joshua versus Tyson Fury is even further away. Oleksandr Usyk could produce a masterclass and beat Anthony Joshua this week at Tottenham Hotspur Stadium. And then before you know it, you've got Joshua Wilder, which was a fight that was being built for 18 months, 2 years, the best part of. That doesn't look likely. Joshua versus Fury potentially doesn't look likely, certainly if one of those loses the fight. And I agree. I think it's something that we need to see more of in boxing, and not seeing those events. And it feels like Terence Crawford is boxing Sean Porter. Very, very good fight. I'm looking forward to it, as I'm sure you are. But it's still not the fight. It's still not the fight that we've all wanted to see, and what we all believe is for the best interest of the sport.
And I think we'll build Crawford against Porter to be a big event. But again, there'll be an element of those of us within boxing almost kidding ourselves that it's it's a big event, but it's not the one that we're all waiting for. And you can't even say at this stage that it's the next step and we're building towards Crawford against Errol Spence, because so much of what we've heard is leading us to believe that that's not going to happen. But what I would say though, Rob, is that that for all this kind of negativity, when you do sit ringside like we will at the weekend and recently in Leeds, there is no sport like it when it gets it right. And I remember Eddie Hearn saying, that the atmosphere for Canelo's fight against Billy Joe Saunders, like 53,000 indoor stroke outdoors in Dallas. And when it gets it right, when there's a massive crowd and those two men are making their way to the ring for the main event, there is nothing like it. And so it just goes to show that there is so much scope for this sport to grow and grow and grow. And in terms of where we are and what we are in this country, what's coming out of the Olympic Games gives us all such hope for the immediate future, but the midterm and the long-term future as well. If you look at what's going on and you hear from Robert McCracken and the other coaches about the amount of talent that's coming through, then there's a lot to be upbeat about. But in terms of the global sense, there is no question that we are missing those absolutely standout events. The events like Emma Raducanu that make everybody, whatever your sporting connections, sit up and listen. That you need those events every now and again. Joshua Fury would have been one of those, where everyone I talk about boxing and contests falling into three categories, Rob. The first category is the one that boxing fans only are interested in, that only us are interested in. The second category is the one where boxing fans and general sports fans get interested in. And the last category is the one that catches everybody, people who don't even necessarily get interested in sport. I remember early on in my commentary career, one of those was David Haye against Nikolai Valuev. Now, the reason was you had this guy who was like 2.5 feet taller than David Haye. So even the mums were saying, he can't go in the ring with him, bless him, that sort of thing. You get that crossover. So that third category of fight, they're too rare. We need more of that third category where everyone this week is talking about Emma Raducanu. And that kind of event, that kind of seismic event is what boxing needs more of.
I always say, and I don't know if you'll agree with this, I always say to people that loving boxing is almost like being in an abusive relationship where you deep down, it's a good sport and it loves you really, and you make excuses for it and what have you, and then you keep going back.
We're all hopeless optimists.
Yeah, and it's that exact thing. Boxing is like a drug, as you say. You're being ringside and getting the hair stand up on the back of your neck and having those brilliant fights that you're so privileged to see. It kind of instills enough time in you that you put up with these little things that go wrong, and you kind of make excuses because you remember how great boxing is when it's great, but they are too few and far between.
They are, but it is amazing how even infrequent dosages work. Like a couple of weeks ago in Leeds, and now we've got another one coming up at the weekend at Tottenham. So that will keep us going for some time, and they will be reminded, whatever the results, that it's the kind of the event status. I mean, the ring walks on Saturday will be an event in itself. So it's really important. Even for all I've said about, the general sports fan wants to see Fury against Joshua rather than Usyk against Joshua. But come Saturday night, this will be huge. When Sweet Caroline's gone and the two men walk to the ring, it will still be very, very special.
It's that 15 seconds, isn't it? Everybody says the same thing. That 15 seconds just after the referee's given the instructions, fighters walk back to the corner, seconds out, bang. Round one. And then you can't, if you could bottle that 15 seconds before a big heavyweight title fight, you could sell that. You'd probably make a few quid out of that. That would be something that you would definitely get addicted to.
Yeah. I mean, that's as they walk away. And that for a commentator is kind of, it's almost a dilemma, Rob, as to whether to add words or just to leave on radio or television, because on radio you can still hear the referee's instructions, because these days the MC puts the microphone to the referee's mouth. So, as a commentator on radio, so you stop talking and you hear whoever the referee might be saying, right, back to your corners. And then there is, as you say, that 10 or 15 seconds while the seconds and the officials leave the ring. And that's a dilemma for a commentator, is do you just leave that noise to build to the crescendo of the bell, or do you just add, a few words to say whatever about, what can you add at that stage is the question. If you can't add anything, then just leave it be and just let that noise, rise to the sound of the bell. And it's like, there are certain sounds in sport, aren't there? And that first bell is like the gun for the final of the 100 meters at the Olympics. It's you've heard that, and that's the start of
and you're kind of you're straight into it then. And then I don't know what it's like for you. What is it like for you as a commentator? Because once that first bell goes, do you switch into kind of, I don't know, fight mode, I guess, or how does that change you just hearing that? I think
you can't help but get wrapped up in it, Rob, because the commentary position in boxing is almost unique. I say almost unique because it would be similar in UFC, but in terms of mainstream sport in this country, for example, and in the other sport I do at the Tokyo Olympics, there were times when, if, say, for example, the triple jump final was on the far side of the stadium, I was 60, 70 meters away from the action. Whereas at ringside, sometimes 60, 70 centimeters away from the action. You're right there. You can't help but feel that bear pit atmosphere. You're right there, and you're looking at the, where the commentary positions are. The first thing you see is the boxer's legs, which is really instructive. Just to move off at a tangent is really instructive if they get hit and hurt. The first thing you see is a boxer's legs stiffen. But you can't help but get wrapped up in that noise and that atmosphere in those last few seconds. And when the bell sounds, it's a bit like that coiled spring. You let rip. And on radio, of course, it's different. That so you're straight into it. But there is very much that sense, in particular with the heavyweights, that this next punch could be the last of the fight. And so I remember on radio, I may have said this to you in the past, but you'd always be wary of wandering into a kind of an anecdote about Joshua's background at Finchley ABC or whatever, just in case you're in the middle of this lovely story about his time with Sean Murphy or whatever, and then bang, he lands the right hand and your anecdote's only half gone, plus you've missed the crucial moment. But it is a great moment for a commentator. It's the best position to be in any sport for me. That expectation after the referee's instructions, before the first bell for a big heavyweight fight is a really special feeling. It's very, very similar in very different circumstances to the start of a big 100 metres final.
That's just what I was about to say.
The big difference being that for the 100 metres final, there is absolute silence. And going back to Tokyo, that's what we were missing this time, Rob, because there was silence. Whereas normally you have the madness of the crowd and then that great hush. Yeah. And that's a really special moment in sport. But we lost that in Tokyo. But in boxing, it's very, very different, And there is sometimes almost where the crowd wait for. There's almost a dimming of the noise where the crowd wait for the bell to sound because they want to hear it as well, and then they go mad again once the action's underway. So, hey, we'll get that again at the weekend. So. Where's all that negativity?
But this is what we were just talking about. We can talk about Oscar Valdez's his failed a VADA test and then was able to fight. I thought he lost the fight as well. I thought Robson Conceição won that fight personally. But anyway, moving on from that, kind of all of the negativity, and then we start talking about the heavyweights and the bell going and the light, and it brings you back into it. Something I wanted to ask you, and I'm not sure if I have actually asked you this in the past. Have you ever had your Harry Carpenter, Frank Bruno moment? Have you ever maybe said something that you felt that you shouldn't have, maybe not necessarily crossed a line or potentially got too involved in a fight?
No, not yet. And it would be partly because of what I've learned from Harry Carpenter, who said that he regretted that till the day he left commentary. Which
is, of course, what he was, he became very well known for it, but of course, not for the reasons that he would have wanted to.
In many ways, was excused that. I think for a number of reasons. The two key reasons were that Frank Bruno was so popular anyway, and he was said to be reflecting what everybody else was saying, which is the aim of a commentator. But secondly, that he'd had such an illustrious career up to that point. That for those who wanted to give a dig, were ready to forgive him that one lapse. I don't actually have that much of an issue with that particular point, but I do think there is an issue, and it might sound poncy, but I think there's an issue around the BBC, in that the BBC belongs to everybody, and there may well have been people who didn't want Frank Bruno to win that night who were watching the BBC, and I'm always very aware of that. All the more so in a really multicultural society, but just generally speaking, that I think it's the case of it's the cause of a commentator that they ought to be neutral all the way along, and then you as the listener or the viewer, now in my case, is you make up your mind as you go along and just be nudged into that opinion by the commentator. But I'm not one for cheering athletes across the line or cheering boxers when they've floored an opponent. If I've been guilty of that, then let somebody bring that up. But I don't think I have. I mean, there's many a time I've said stuff I regretted, or more to the point, I think, and many a commentator would agree with me. There's many a time I wish I'd said something, but I've only thought of it on the way home. So that's one of the challenges of commentary.
You make a great point there. Something that we spoke about when you were Mike Costello of the BBC, when we did our initial interview. One of the things that people were talking about when Eddie announced that they were going to be doing Matchroom Media, they were going to be taking the production in-house. We were going to pick our own commentary team. A lot of people were worried about a bias, having house commentary team, so to speak. It seemed to me, at least, that a lot of those concerns were alleviated when he announced you as the lead comms. That must be such a great thing to hear, a real mark of respect from boxing fans to, okay, well, Mike Costello's doing it, so we know he's going to be down the middle. That must be so rewarding for you.
Yeah, but I think the test will come then when there is maybe a very tight decision, and the feeling is that we, whoever I'm commentating with, have gone too strong on the side of one side or the other. So that, I think that test is still to come, Rob. But I mean that was part of the discussions with Eddie from a very early stage, that I'm not going to be involved as a cheerleader, but at the same time I'm not going to go on air every night and smash the show to pieces. But I never did that on BBC Radio anyway, because I understand why sometimes promotions don't work. There's many a fight I've said on paper would be a dream fight and hasn't happened, and it hasn't. I don't mean hasn't happened in terms of getting into the ring. Hasn't kicked off, hasn't worked out in the way that I thought it would. So I understand some the issues that some promoters have. Not all of the issues in getting a show on, of course, but I think that's a really important part of the makeup of what we do from here on, is that we're seen to be absolutely neutral.
We've spoken about Tyson Fury and Deontay Wilder, of course, a few weeks away from that now. It seems to me, at least, that had this fight have happened 12 months ago, I think people would have still heavily backed Tyson Fury. I think it's fair to say he still will rightfully go into the bout as a significant favourite, considering what happened not only in the second fight, but of course the first fight, which many people, myself included, felt that he was harshly judged to get a draw. But it seems to be now we've had kind of, nearly 2 years, which is unfathomable. The best part of 2 years, about 20 months since that rematch, that people seem to feel that it's potentially a little bit closer than it would have been 12 or 14 months ago. How do you see the trilogy playing out?
I don't really understand why and how suddenly Wilder's going to be dramatically different. He's been around a long time. He was a long reigning champion, shouldn't forget that. And to think that he can dramatically change what he's been doing throughout his career, suddenly in the course of whatever the space of 18 months or so, maybe less than that, because he's not been training the whole time, I'd be very doubtful that he can do that. I'm with you when you said earlier on that he could still land the big one. There's the potential for that, but I think Fury has shown that he has, as in Wilder has, a serious weakness on the back foot and struggles when he's pushed back, as so many of the punchers have shown down the years in whatever weight division. And so if Fury, can be as dominant as he was last time, I don't get the notion that Wilder's going to be very different this time with new trainers around him. And I remember Enzo Calzaghe, Joe's dad, telling me once when Mike Costello came over and spoke about how he was going to be very different to what he'd done before. And Enzo, he didn't laugh at it because he respected Kessler, but he almost smirked and said, "Don't worry, Mike, they always revert to type. Eventually, under the lights, under pressure, they revert to type." And that's, I think, what will happen to Deontay Wilder.
Particularly when he has probably, I would imagine Tyson Fury will be that heavier weight that we saw in the rematch, when you have a 19.5 stone, 6'9" man walking you down and landing those shots. I think for me, psychologically, it's going to be very, very interesting. I think Deontay Wilder has done a pretty good job of selling the trilogy bout. I don't think 12, 14 months ago, many people would have been particularly interested in it because of the one-sided nature of the rematch. But, he's said some good things. He's put out some outlandish social media videos and what have you, but for me, I think the most significant part of the fight is when Tyson Fury is able to land early in the fight, and what memories that brings back for Deontay Wilder, because he got an absolute shellacking in the second fight in Las Vegas
and floored with a body shot. There are all sorts of memories that potentially could haunt him, and all going back to the first fight, he's hit him with two of the best punches he's thrown in his entire career, and the bloke got up. What that must do to somebody who's been flooring people almost for fun, and every time he connected strongly, pretty much they've gone over, and suddenly this man does go over. He turns around to celebrate, and when he turns back, he sees how on earth is this man is getting up. He's getting up virtually from the dead in boxing terms. And then in the second fight, dominated from the beginning, gets floored by a body punch, so there's variety to deal with. And I think that psychologically for Wilder is such a huge mountain to climb. But look at this. We've been talking again about what this means for the heavyweight division. If Wilder won, just imagine how that invigorates the division. Because suddenly you've got this. If let's take a scenario, the next few weeks now, Joshua beats Usyk and Wilder beats Fury. Then you've suddenly got a conversation that's Joshua, Fury and Wilder now. And suddenly there's maybe even more interest in the heavyweight division, which brings in the American element all over again. So in terms of those of us on the outside, look, of course, we've dealt with Tyson Fury in the media sense in the past, so we want Tyson Fury to win that one. But there's a case for saying that if Wilder wins, it's not a case of boxing being in desperate straits.
We'd probably go to Wilder Fury 4. Which would be, I can't think of many heavyweight bouts, or indeed many bouts at all that have had 4 bouts. Vasquez and Marquez had 4 bouts, but outside of that, I can't think of too many. I mean, you have to go back a long time.
Yeah, I can't think.
If you can't think, I've got no chance. But anyway, let's move on. We've spoken about just one thing I'd like to get your opinion on. I don't want to talk about Evander Holyfield. We won't talk about that. But Jake Paul and Logan Paul, obviously ushering in this kind of new digital wave, I guess you would call it, of boxing. I think it's fair to say that you're certainly considered to be, a traditionalist in the nicest sense of the word in the sport. What do you make of kind of the Jake Paul impact on boxing in recent years?
Yeah, I don't have a problem with this. I think most people would expect me to be shouting and screaming, but I don't have a problem with it. And I go back to an instance over here some years back now. Was it 2016, 2017, when Freddie Flintoff had a go at professional boxing at the Manchester Arena, trained by
Shane McGuigan,
Barry and Shane McGuigan, and they had a real input into that. And I think it was either Sky Sports or it might have been Channel 4 ran a 2 or 3 part documentary following him in the training process. And they showed him at one stage, I remember, sat on the ring apron after a sparring session, and it was either his nose or his lip was bleeding, and he was puffing and panting and struggling for breath. And I just thought that there, for people who hadn't visited boxing before, to see how much effort it takes to be very, very ordinary, just start to understand what it takes to be a Mayweather or an Oscar de la Hoya or whatever the case may be. So I thought that actually some good could be taken out of that. And I say the same about Jake Paul. And what I will at least accept is that they do respect the sport. They might not sound like it in some of their press conferences and what they say about Tommy Fury or whatever, but they do at least go to the gym and they give it the required work. What I said earlier on, way back in the days when Jake Paul had his first or second contest, I said that what he's showing for a 2-bout amateur, which is what he is actually what I would expect to see going back to my coaching days at the Lynn in South London. I'd actually be quite contented with a kid producing what he produced after 2 contests. I'd be more than happy with what he showed. The problem is when they start to talk about taking on the bigger names. When Logan Paul gets in with Floyd Mayweather, that's something completely different. But when it's a case of Jake Paul being matched reasonably competitively against opposition that's of a similar nature, then I don't see the harm in that, as long as they're respecting the sport. What Logan Paul then did and moved away against KSI, I get that. That was for two bout, 3 bout novices, whatever they were. That was a decent contest, and I won't listen to anybody who tells me otherwise. Now, did it have a place on a world championship bill in Los Angeles? That I'm open to be persuaded, maybe not. But we have to understand where these boxers like Jake Paul draw their audiences from. I'm not one who's greatly convinced by the argument they bring more eyes to the sport, because I think they bring different eyes who follow Jake Paul, and they'll move off, and they won't necessarily come across and marvel at the skills of a Floyd Mayweather or these days an Inoue or whoever. But I think the damage to boxing that's spoken about, I think, is overestimated. I think the real damage, the serious damage, is this stuff with Holyfield, and it could have been De La Hoya. And I just think somehow, to me, from my stance, it doesn't feel like boxing, so I can almost comfortably ignore it. But I'm afraid too many people, generally speaking, do associate that with boxing, and they refer to that as boxing's problem, because boxing hasn't stopped it, and therefore boxing must be the problem, and boxing is a circus, and boxing is a farce. And also, when you see contests like David Haye against Joe Fournier, and I just, my worry about what happens with Logan Paul and Mayweather, when that spreads to a wider audience, you start to then build this kind of ethos, this feeling that was around when I was a kid, first going into a gym. I was on the back end of the black and white movies from the 60s and the 50s before I was born, when every fight was fixed according to Hollywood. Every fight was fixed. And I think there's just a danger now that massive audience that watched them, like 1 million pay-per-view buys for some of these fights, and if they become aware that these fights, are organised, are set up, that then for me ricochets onto boxing, that people think, because you'll have bumped into people all the way along asking you, was that fight fixed? Was this fight fixed? And it's something that's boxing's had to fend off for decades and decades. And I just think that anything that emphasises the possibility of that is a danger to the sport. And I think that's why my big fear around this kind of YouTuber effect and worse still, the old men getting into the ring, that if it's been organised, then there's a general feeling that that's just how boxing works. Big deal, shrug your shoulders.
Yeah, I agree. It seems bizarre to have seen David Haye have a move around with Joe Fournier. Not a fan of him calling out Tyson Fury, I'm assuming.
But look, I've known David for a long time, and I realise that's for him reaching out for almost the impossible. But I'd rather remember David Haye on the night in Paris when I was commentating, when he got off the floor and won that fight. And that was one of the great performances by a British boxer overseas in the history of this sport. And then he goes on to do what he did against Valuev. Okay, Valuev is never in danger of being ranked highly amongst the all-time greats of the heavyweight division, but it was a very, very impressive performance against somebody who'd held the title and who'd beaten Evander Holyfield. Although I thought Holyfield won that night.
I thought Holyfield won that night as well.
But hey, he got the nod. So it was at least competitive against Evander Holyfield, and David Haye for me made him look silly. So
Okay, Mike, it's always a pleasure catching up with you. I'm very grateful for you popping in here. I know you're a very, very busy man. So yeah, I'd just like to once again thank you for coming on the Boxing Social podcast. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, and I'm sure everybody watching did and listening did as well. Congratulations again on your new venture at DAZN. I can see the boyish look in your face and how excited it's made you, and that's great to see. So thanks very much for stopping by.
Thanks for your time, Rob, and all the best for the future with all your new ventures.
Thanks very much.